All right, well, thank you, Chris and Pastor Mark, for giving me the opportunity to get up here. This is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I feel very strongly about these issues. My journey has been taking place on this topic over the last 10 plus years, but more recently has been happening just in the last 12 months or so, as some of these topics have really come to the forefront within the church and within the Christian community. And so I've spent a lot of time working through these issues, and I believe we're at a pivotal point in the fight against abortion. I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade a few years ago really kind of set a precedent, or set this topic before us to really clarify what it is that we believe. In some regard, we've made a lot of progress since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There has been a lot of movement in anti-abortion bills and in protecting the lives of the unborn. But on the other hand, I fear that a lot of organizations, a lot of people who consider themselves pro-life, have lost the clarity that they need on what it means to oppose abortion and to stand up for the lives of the unborn. This discussion is timely because of the introduction of Proposition 81 in Colorado. Pastor Chris has talked a lot about that. A lot of you are actively out there working on getting signatures for this proposition. And what this proposition is unique in Colorado. There has not been an equal protection initiative worked on previous to Proposition 81. There have been other pro-life initiatives that we voted on that have gathered signatures, but none of them were equal protection measures. And so part of my goal today is to help make sure everyone understands what is the difference between previous anti-abortion or abortion limiting initiatives versus Proposition 81 and other equal protection measures. So a little bit about my experience. I once considered myself a pro-life libertarian, but I would have supported certain exceptions, and I was very much in favor of an incrementalist approach, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but basically that we're going to do this in small steps so that we have a higher likelihood of passing these laws. But soon after we joined Norwood here, Becky and I became the ambassadors for Life Network, and so that gave me the opportunity to really dig into the abortion issue and understand at a deeper level what it is that we're fighting for, and what it really is what our goal is in opposing abortion. I always believed that the end goal, even from an incrementalist standpoint, that the end goal was the unequivocal abolition of abortion, to where abortion would be completely, not just unthinkable, but it would be illegal in the civil sphere. Unfortunately, the overturning of Roe v. Wade exposed that lie. And so the truth is, unfortunately, that the pro-life establishment does not believe in equal protection or desire the unequivocal end of abortion. Now, I realize that's a bold and shocking statement. And when I first encountered this, I didn't believe it. I didn't. I said, this has been the talking point of pro-life organizations. How is it that they cannot support these equal protection measures? But there are growing piles of evidence that national right-to-life organizations and even pro-life organizations in our state of Colorado do not support equal protection and want to have exceptions where abortion is permitted. There are organizations in Colorado that are actively working against Proposition 81, even though they consider themselves pro-life. Those of us that are circulating Proposition 81 have either encountered this opposition firsthand, or if you haven't, I can almost guarantee that you will at some point encounter opposition from people who consider themselves Christians and consider themselves pro-life. So my goal today is to define what is equal protection from a biblical perspective, and then address some of those objections that you're likely to hear from the pro-life crowd. So this discussion is primarily focused on people who already consider themselves Christians and already consider themselves pro-life. So I want to start with just a few assumptions that we have. That these are 4 points that I think most, if not all, Christians and pro-life people would agree to, at least on paper. And so the first one is that every human being is made in the image of God. And we can find this from the original creation account. In Genesis 1:26 through 27, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." And so we see from the very beginning that human life is worthy of protection because it is made in the image of God. And then in the New Testament, in James, talking about taming the tongue, he says that with the tongue, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. And so why is it wrong to curse people, other human beings? Because they are made in the image of God. And so equal protection, why is it important to protect human beings and human life? Because they are made in the likeness and in the image of God. Human life begins at conception. In Psalm 139, 13 through 16, talking about the insurmountable knowledge of God, the psalmist says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." And so we see that God knew you and knew your existence before you were born in the womb. And so we believe as Christians and a biblical standing that life begins at conception. The third point then is that murder is the unlawful taking of innocent human life. And in God's renewed covenant with Noah in Genesis 9, he tells Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." And so again, killing innocent human beings is wrong because they are made in the likeness of God. And in Jeremiah's message, bringing God's message to the king of Judah, he says, "Thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed, and do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place." And so God takes murder of humans made in his likeness very seriously. And then the final point, we see that abortion is murder. And so in Psalm 106, when the psalmist is talking about God giving the Israelites over to all manner of evil because of their disobedience, he says, "They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood." And so the idol of our culture today is self-centered individualism. We promote self-centered and our feelings above everything else, including the protection of humans made in the likeness of God. So these 4 points are things that I think if you were to talk to most pro-life people, pro-life Christians, they would agree with these points. So where does it fall apart, or where is the disagreement? And so I want to talk about equal protection. Equal protection is required by God's law. God requires fairness in business dealings and in the administration of justice. In Leviticus 19:15 and again in Deuteronomy 16, God describes in his law the importance of having equal weights and measures and unbiased judgments when we're dealing with justice. So in Leviticus it says, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." And then in Deuteronomy 16, it says, "You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you." And then in Proverbs 20:10 says, "Unequal weights and unequal measures are both alike an abomination to the Lord." So equal protection means applying the law consistently for all human beings, regardless of age or gender. In our own Constitution, the 14th Amendment reads, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Unfortunately, this amendment has not been fully realized in our country. And just like the Declaration of Independence, when it declared that all men are created equal, took over 100 years for slavery to be abolished and for that ideal to actually be realized. The ideal of the 14th Amendment has not been realized in any state in our country. And so that's what it means to advocate for equal protection. We want to see the words that are written in our Constitution, we want to see them applied consistently to all areas of life, but in particular, in protecting the lives of all people, no matter what age they are. So some might say, well, haven't there been 14 states in the U.S. that have passed abortion bans since the overturn of Roe v. Wade? Well, there have been 14 so-called abortion bans, legislation passed in 14 states, but 10 of those states have passed legislation making it only illegal for providers. So you cannot run a Planned Parenthood clinic or an abortion clinic in those states. 4 states have exceptions for rape and incest. But the truth is that in all 50 states, abortion is still permitted for a certain segment of the population. In particular, self-administered abortions are completely legal in all 14 of those states that have passed supposed abortion bans through the abortion pill, which is easily available through the mail. There are no consequences, even in the most pro-life states, for killing your own child or even forcing someone else to kill their own child. These laws are unequal weights and measures. So all 14 of these states, they carve out exceptions explicitly allowing mothers to kill their children with impunity. Just for one example, this is from the trigger law in Kentucky. So this was the law that was passed as soon as Roe v. Wade was overturned. And it says, "Nothing in this section may be construed to subject the pregnant mother upon whom an abortion is performed or attempted to any criminal conviction and penalty. This simple exception means that mothers can kill their own children without any consequences and with impunity, using most commonly the abortion pill. All 14 states contain a similar exception as the Kentucky law. So now that we've laid a little bit of a foundation here of what equal protection means and why it's important, and looking at some of the laws that have already been passed, I want to focus most of our time on discussing some of the objections that you'll hear from the pro-life crowd. And so the first one is, well, aren't women victims of abortion also? And this is the reasoning behind many of those exceptions in the abortion ban bills. They will say women are just victims. Women should not be prosecuted in any way for any kind of abortion. And so many pro-life organizations do not support anything that could result in the prosecution of women. But equal protection laws do not target women specifically. You'll hear people say that. People will claim, well, these bills or Proposition 81, you're targeting women. But these measures, these equal protection measures, do not target women. They simply do not carve out exceptions based solely on gender. So the principal actor affecting a murder is the one who carries the primary responsibility. And unfortunately, arguments supporting these exceptions inevitably borrow from pro-abortion talking points. And I've had the unfortunate experience of hearing these firsthand and hearing people who consider themselves pro-life borrowing arguments and using the same kind of reasoning that the pro-abortion crowd would use in order to defend these exceptions and to oppose equal protection laws. And one that I hear commonly is that women are incapable of understanding what abortion is. They just don't understand. They're ignorant. First of all, that really downplays the intelligence of women. I think women are a lot smarter than the pro-life establishment gives them credit for, and women are capable of understanding and capable of knowing what is happening in an abortion. Also, another talking point I've heard is that these women are in terrible situations, which is unfortunately true. There are many situations that women find themselves in when they come into pregnancy centers, especially. It's usually because they are struggling with family issues or pressure from people in their lives. But that doesn't justify allowing them to kill their own children. Another common issue that I like, or topic that I like to bring up, is if a mother were to strangle their child 5 seconds after that baby was born, most of these pro-life organizations or people would agree that the mother should be charged with murder in that situation. So what is the difference between 5 seconds after birth and 5 seconds before birth? This is the same argument we would make to someone who's pro-abortion and says that you can have an abortion up till birth. It's the same issue in this case, dealing with mothers in particular. Another example is you'll hear people say that we should go after the abortion providers. We don't want to prosecute women. They're just the victims, but we want to make it illegal for providers to distribute the abortion pill. Well, first, that's great. Let's go after the providers. But this argument is the same argument that the gun control crowd makes when they say, we're not going to go after the one who uses a gun to commit a murder. We are instead going after the gun manufacturers. And so thinking about those kind of arguments exposes the faulty reasoning behind many of these exceptions. But we are not denying that some women find themselves in terrible situations. But the truth is that our justice system already takes into account these kinds of issues when deciding whether to prosecute, when deciding level of guilt, and when deciding appropriate punishment. The justice system exists to look at the facts and the nuances of individual cases and make a determination based on those facts. But that is a role for the justice system, not for our laws. Our laws need to be consistent. So homicide laws in Colorado and throughout the country already take into account things like mental state, coercion, self-defense, and even ignorance. And equal protection for children would not prevent showing compassion and care for women in difficult situations. Compassion and mercy are available to sinners. In John chapter 8, when Jesus is talking to the crowd and the woman is brought to him who is caught in adultery, I'm going to read the whole passage here because I think it's very critical to understand what is happening around that situation. So it says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, 'Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What do you say?' This they said to him to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, 'Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her.' And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, 'Woman, where are they now? Has no one condemned you?' She said, 'No one, Lord.' And Jesus said, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more.'" So in this passage, Jesus showed compassion to a sinner, but he didn't show compassion to the sinner by condemning the law of Moses. In other passages, Jesus upholds the law, and he says, "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." And so he did not say that the law must be changed to exclude women caught in adultery. But in this case, in this situation, he is able to show compassion and mercy to a sinner, and he says, "Go and sin no more." And so whether you say that she didn't know what she was doing or she was forced into it, the command is to go and sin no more. And so one of the primary objectives of the law is to educate people about God's moral standards. And we are to teach these standards to our families and to our communities. In Deuteronomy, God tells Moses, he says, "And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." And so our job as Christians is to bring the law of God into our society. I've had the opportunity to attend Brian and Maria Taylor's class on worldviews, and one of the topics that they bring up specifically about law is that the purpose of legislators and the purpose of laws in our state and in our country is not to create laws. They don't come up with these ideas themselves, but it's to move God's existing law into the civil sphere and into our society. And so that's what we want to do with an equal protection law. We want to make it clear that abortion is murder because children are worthy of being protected at any age. And as long as we carve out an exception for one segment of the population, we're saying abortion is okay in this one instance. And if our communication is that it's okay here, why should we expect women to understand what it is that they're doing and expect them to agree that it's wrong if we're carving out these exceptions? And then the last point on here is that the truth is not all women are victims. This isn't to deny that there are difficult situations and there are cases where women can be a victim in cases of sexual violence or even coercion. But the truth is there are many women in this country who know exactly what they're doing and they aren't ashamed to admit it. And a prime example of that is the Shout Your Abortion group. On their website, they say front and center in bold letters, "We will aid and abet abortion." And they have this statement on their site saying that courts cannot stop safe abortions from happening, especially now that we have abortion pills. This is just one example of an organization that is actively promoting self-administered abortions in those 14 states and around the country, but in particular those 14 states that have passed abortion bans. The reason that courts cannot stop abortion from happening is because of the exceptions like we saw in the Kentucky law. Because they've carved out this one segment for self-administered abortions, abortion will never be eradicated in those states as long as those exceptions exist. Under the Colorado Criminal Code, it defines first-degree murder as anyone causing the death of a child under 12 years in a position of trust who ought to know better. If that doesn't describe the mother and the father, I don't know what does. This definitely applies to men who might coerce their wives or girlfriends into an abortion, but it equally applies to any woman who would take an abortion pill or perform a self-administered abortion. So this is probably the biggest objection that you may hear from those in the pro-life movement. But there are some other objections that will often come up, one of them being the idea that just in Colorado especially, it's not politically feasible to pass a law like Proposition 81. And so you'll hear that, it's not politically feasible. But compromising the truth for strategic reasons undermines the integrity of God's word, and we are called to hold fast to what is true. In Joshua 1, before Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land, God tells Joshua, "The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So the Israelites had just spent 40 years in the wilderness because they did not think it was politically feasible to enter the promised land. And now Joshua is getting ready to lead the Israelites into Canaan, and God tells him to be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. And to remember to focus on the law of God. And then our study in 1 Peter. Peter says, "Be sober-minded and watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And in 2 Timothy, Paul writes, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." And so compromising what you know about truth is fundamentally dishonest. We must clearly communicate the truth or lose all credibility. In Zechariah 8:16, we see that truthfulness is associated with justice. It says, "These are the things that you shall do. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace." So it is true that Proposition 81 has an uphill battle in Colorado. The odds are stacked against this proposition ever becoming law. This may be the first equal protection law or initiative introduced in Colorado, but it's not going to be the last. And we must clearly engage the culture from the Word of God. That's not to discount what God can do in the midst of opposition. And so we work diligently on Proposition 81 and to pass Proposition 81, knowing that God is capable of overcoming those odds in one of the most pro-abortion states in the nation. But we also recognize that this is not limited to just a short-term battle. This is something that we must be committed to long-term. And William Wilberforce, who is known as one of the most famous abolitionists in England against slavery, spent his entire life introducing bills after bill to end slavery. None of them at the time were politically feasible. For over 40 years, the odds were stacked against him. But slavery was finally abolished in 1833, only 3 days before his death. So even if it's something that we don't see in our lifetime or we don't see until the day before we die, we are called to actively and uncompromisingly promote what is true in our culture. So you might say, okay, but what if we do it in small steps? And so this is the incrementalist argument. Personally, I'm sympathetic to this argument. I think there may be something to be said for if we can pass small things at a time, where other things maybe not. I can be sympathetic in some regard to this incrementalist approach, or at least in my previous thinking about abortion, this is a topic that I might have brought up, especially with Roe v. Wade before that was abolished. Some of these arguments may have had additional credibility. But I always assumed that the end goal was the complete eradication of abortion. And so the lie is exposed when so-called pro-life organizations continue to oppose abolition even when it becomes politically feasible. And so one example of this was the HB 813 Abolition of Abortion in Louisiana Act of 2022. This bill had a high likelihood of passing the legislature. It had support in both the House, the Senate, and the governor had said he would sign this bill of abolition. It was an equal protection measure. It wasn't it wasn't the pro-abortion, it wasn't Planned Parenthood that came out and opposed this bill. It was Louisiana Right to Life and other pro-life organizations that came out in force against this bill and effectively killed it. The reason abortion is still legal in Louisiana today is because of the pro-life establishment. Planned Parenthood and other pro-abortion organizations didn't have to lift a finger to oppose this bill. And so right there, that incrementalist approach is clearly It only works if the end goal is the complete abolition of abortion. So the Bible has a lot to say about compromising truth for expedience. In Proverbs 23:23, it says, "Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding." In Proverbs 11:3, it says, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them." And then in Ephesians 4:25, it says, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another." And then finally here in Psalm 15, it says, "O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right, and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue, and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest, and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved." And so our focus has to be on clearly presenting what is true according to God's law. And that cannot allow for exceptions in certain circumstances or for certain people, and it cannot allow partial or only half-truths. A half-truth is the same as a lie. Those are some of the most common objections that you'll hear or that I've heard from pro-abortion organizations. But there are a few other objections you might hear come up specifically related around the health exceptions. And so I do want to at least briefly address some of those items. So one is miscarriages. Sometimes people will say, well, isn't a miscarriage a spontaneous abortion? So if you abolish abortion, you're effectively abolishing miscarriages. But this is just a misdirection. All of the equal protection laws, either explicitly or even just by the nature of equal protection, applies to living human beings. And so Proposition 81, for example, specifically says that this law applies to living human beings. And so just to read that section from Proposition 81 here, it says, "Lawful protection, a living human child must not be intentionally dismembered, mutilated, poisoned, scalded, starved, stabbed, given toxic injections known to cause death, left to die of the elements for lack of warmth or nutrition, used for experimentation, or treated in any way inhumanely to cause intentional physical harm leading to intended death, or intended to cause disability to otherwise healthy and functioning parts of the body of the child." So abortion supporters have tried to link miscarriages and abortion, but these laws would apply to living children. No equal protection measure would apply to children who die naturally, either inside or outside the womb. This is also one reason why many equal protection measures and bills do not even mention the word abortion, and instead focus on extending existing homicide protection from conception until natural death. So what about ectopic pregnancies or other health issues for the mother? If the mother's life is in danger, surely that would mean that it's okay to abort a pregnancy. But the truth is, in most ectopic pregnancies, the child has already died by the time it's even discovered. And so this is very similar to a miscarriage in that it does not require intentionally killing the child in order to treat the mother. There are times when a pregnancy must be ended by delivering a child early. In these cases, the chance of survival for the child may be limited, but there is no circumstances where the child must be intentionally killed. And this topic is personal to Becky and I because our son Robert was born 5 weeks early due to an emergency C-section. And Becky's life was in danger if the pregnancy had continued. And so the doctors advised us that the only option available for saving Becky's life was to deliver Robert by emergency C-section. He was born 5 weeks early. And in this case, though, ending the pregnancy did not mean intentionally killing Robert. It meant delivering him. And I'm grateful that God provided doctors that were committed to protecting both Becky's life and Robert's life. He stopped breathing after he was born for a few seconds, and they worked diligently to revive him and to help with his underdeveloped lungs. And so there's no situation where protecting the mother and treating the health concerns of the mother involves intentionally killing the baby. Doctors may do what is necessary. Doctors may do what is necessary to treat the mother while simultaneously making every attempt to save the child also. And another topic you may hear come up is surrounding in vitro fertilization. This has been in the news lately because of I believe it was Alabama that had passed a law, or it was the Supreme Court that had passed a judgment that said IVF would be covered by their abortion ban. And so what are the problems with IVF treatments? First of all, embryos are genetically complete human beings. And so to have a consistent view on life and life beginning at conception requires us to recognize that these embryos that are created during the IVF process, they result in fertilized embryos and they are complete human beings. Unused embryos are unceremoniously killed or discarded. And so a consistent understanding requires us to recognize that these embryos are made in the image of God and that we cannot just kill them at will. So there is a topic that some have talked about called ethical IVF. And ethical IVF basically means that the number of embryos created is limited, so only 2 to 3 maybe at a time are created, and all of them are eventually implanted and given an opportunity to grow. This is an area where there is some disagreement even among abolitionist organizations. And so there are some nuances that you may have to talk through and determine, but the point and the thing to keep in mind is that we're looking for a consistent view of what it means that life begins at conception and that life is valuable and made in the image of God. So those are the most common objections that I've heard. I would definitely be interested in hearing if there's objections that you all have heard within your discussions with either pro-life people or even others. But some of the things that we can do, I think we are called to speak to people who claim to be pro-life and help them understand the biblical foundations of equal protection. These people claim to agree with the 4 points we looked at the beginning of the slides today. And so our job is to communicate to them the importance of carrying that view and carrying those beliefs to their consistent conclusions. I would also recommend using terms such as abolitionist instead of pro-life. I think abolitionist just makes it clear what it is that we're committed to and what our end goal really is. And we need to be prepared to address objections from pro-life leaders and be able to speak to those leaders and show them that their view, that what they're advocating for or against is unbiblical. And finally, we should support organizations committed to abolition instead of the pro-life establishment. And so I would encourage you to go out and find those organizations. I have some resources here I'll put up at the end as a starting point, but there are organizations that are actively working towards abolition. And so part of our job is to support those organizations and lift them up instead of focusing on the pro-life establishment. So that's everything that I have today. Here's a few of those resources that I talked about. There's End Abortion Now, and then Abolitionists Rising. There's a couple videos that I would definitely recommend if you have time to put them on in the background or listen to them if you can. The first one is from Jeff Durbin and End Abortion Now. It's called The Fatal Flaw, Lies, Laws, and Pro-Life Deception. This is a documentary specifically about the Louisiana bill. End Abortion Now was heavily involved in getting that bill in front of the legislatures, and they were there and saw firsthand all of the opposition that came out against it. So this is a good documentary if you want to hear more about that particular, about that specific bill. And then also there was a good debate that happened recently with Abolitionists Rising and Joel Berry, he's the editor of the Babylon Bee. And this was a good, friendly conversation. It's 2 hours long, so it'll take some time to go through. But there's a lot of good information bringing up many of these points that we discussed today. So thank you again for letting me present this. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about this more. If you have questions about anything we've talked about here or things that I didn't bring up, I'm sure Pastor Mark and Pastor Chris would also be willing to talk with you as well. We've got about 5 minutes or so if there are any questions